I don't think so, no, because you see, the way our economy works is as a free trading mechanism where what we really want is for things to be priced at what they genuinely cost. And if you put tariffs up, of course, you're overpricing them, and that's why we object to EU protectionism. The issue of deficits, you see, on trade is really much more about running our own economy. I mean, our problem has been not the EU deficit, but the fact that 3 years ago, we ran a deficit on current account of 7% of GDP. That was almost on the scale of Greece before the crisis. And not quite, actually. Greece was like 17%. It kind of went completely balmy. But we had quite a big deficit on current account in 2015. And one of the things that's happened as a result of Brexit is a big devaluation of the pound that has started already to correct that, and has brought our general balance of payments deficit down to about 3.5% of GDP, and I think we'll bring it down steadily to something like 1 or even 0, which will be in balance. And I don't think it would be certainly would not be a good idea to use tariffs to correct our trade deficits in general, because, as I say, that puts a burden on the consumer. Whereas if you correct it by the exchange rate, what that does is prompt market forces to eliminate this imbalance. And then, if you've got an overall balance on current account, it really doesn't matter if you have a deficit with one group of countries versus a surplus with another, because that's just market forces working out in a way that your consumers and your producers want. It reflects your comparative advantage and what your consumers want to buy, and that's entirely fine. The only problem is, as I say, the overall current account deficit, which is being corrected by the Brexit devaluation. So I think it's on course to be solved.
Given how close two of the votes were yesterday, how confident are you that Theresa May can get the rest of the amendments through, especially now, obviously, you've lost Ian Paisley for 30 days?
Well, the main thing now is that the first bill on Monday, a customs bill, I think we will be okay on that because it is a money bill, and the Lords, I think, will have difficulty in putting down amendments which will stick there and which will come back. Trade bill, clearly there's an issue about the amendment that was passed on the Medicines Agency, but I think that it's an effective amendment. It doesn't actually stack up, so that'll have to be corrected in the Lords or back in the Commons. Just, the government has said it wants to be associated with some projects and things that are good for the UK if it's our mutual interest, but we can't sort of just be a member and just take the rules and pay in and all that stuff. I think that most of the legislation now, the big legislation was the EU withdrawal bill, and obviously that's now got royal assent. The big issues that will come down the line is, of course, the meaningful vote and the final withdrawal bill. Those are the critical issues. I think that it will depend on whether or not we get a good deal at the end of the day, whether there's a majority for any particular proposition. I think at the moment it would seem to me, just observing the situation, that it would be difficult to find any proposition that would gain a majority in the House of Commons at the moment. I think it's a bit like House of Lords reform. Remember, we had 5 options and not one of them could get a majority. And at the moment, I think that's a bit the way Brexit is, unless something changes. That's what it's looking like at the moment.
One of the leaks before the Chequers meeting was that the Chancellor, Mr. Hammond, was going to do a presentation on the loss of revenue to the Treasury. I was very interested in that. I wondered where on earth it was going to be generated. I've never heard a peep since. Can you enlighten me?
Well, it is a bit mysterious, but I'll tell you where it all comes from. It comes from the civil service. The civil service, I think, probably under the protection of Mrs. May, produced something called the Cross-Whitehall report on Brexit, which was leaked to BuzzFeed. Do you remember all that?
Yes.
I always called it the BuzzFeed report because I think it's such a lovely way to leak things to BuzzFeed. Anyway, it buzzed around a lot as a result. And of course, in this report, which was secret at first, they found that there was a 7% loss to GDP of leaving the EU under WTO terms, and slightly smaller if we had a trade agreement, but still substantial, which were extraordinary numbers. And they all came out of this border calculation that both Nigel and I have talked about. This idea that once you leave the EU, suddenly there are these big standard problems of the border, and the borders, instead of becoming seamless, everything gets held up in Dover and Calais and everywhere else, which is of course complete nonsense and completely illegal under WTO rules. So what happened was that they put all these assumptions into this BuzzFeed report and got these terrible, horrendous results. They also said that FTAs with the US and other countries would produce trivial gains, which is demonstrably false under the model they were using. So it was a pretty good mess intellectually. And the interesting thing was, as you might say, they wouldn't come out and fight. They wouldn't come out and fight. Instead, what happened? They went to the Hillary Benz committee, BREXIT committee, and they gave them 24 PowerPoint slides. That was the report. 24 PowerPoint slides, which you can hardly read. You have to get really up close to see what they're saying. I mean, it's extraordinary. So they haven't, and they have refused to show any of their report workings. And the Project Fear report that Barry referred to, that the Treasury did in 2016 before Brexit, it ran to 250 pages, I think, with 8 appendices. I mean, I read them all several times. And there was an awful lot there. So that's what civil servants usually do, but they wouldn't do it on this occasion because they knew that it was indefensible. And they won't come up from fight because they know it is intellectually indefensible in terms of the things that Nigel and I have said about borders, standards, normal trade relations under WTO. But it was used to terrorize the public, you know, and to terrorize everybody into thinking that, oh gosh, if we left under sensible conditions WTO rules, there'd be a terrible disaster. Of course, it's not true. It's the opposite is the truth. If we leave under WTO rules, we get a proper Brexit, as Nigel has described. And that gives us huge gains, because we go to free trade under an organization that regulates most of the trade in the world, including most of our trade, by the way, is already. So it's all nonsense. And it was basically concocted in order to terrorize politicians and public opinion into accepting what have now become the Chequers proposals, which are effectively to keep us in the EU.
So loss of tax revenue, where does he generate that from?
Well, it comes, if GDP falls 7%, you lose 10% tax revenue.
So that's what all these...
Yeah, that's where it all comes from. I mean, it's very straightforward arithmetic. Basically, the gearing of revenue is 1.5 to the GDP.
I thought it was loss of common external tariff, which you give to the...
No, it's got nothing to do with any of that. It's just straight, plain, loss of GDP, loss of revenue.
Okay.
It's plain vanilla.
Yeah. And it's right.
Nothing else. There's nothing else in there.
One of the big features of the debate has been about this no-deal proposition. Now, I think it's actually misleading because what they haven't considered is Article 24 of the WTO treaty, which states even if we don't leave without a deal, we revert to the same standards for 10 years. So in other words, we negotiate out of the EU with the same agreement that we have now, but onto WTO terms over the next 10 years. Why haven't people talked about this? Because it seems to me that they're missing the point that it's basically bigging up Project Fear, and this is not Project Fear, this is Project Truth.
I think that this has been pointed out by a number of politicians and some commentators, but of course it doesn't suit the agenda. I mean, the no-deal scenario was painted as the worst outcome of all. And of course, you know, let's make it very, very clear. You know, a no deal is better than a bad deal. I totally agree with that. But a good deal is better than a no deal. You know, let's not get carried away. I mean, my view is that if we could get a good deal, that's in the interests of everybody, the EU and the UK. But if we can't get a good deal, and certainly the EU haven't shown much signs of being prepared to negotiate in any way sensibly or to take into account even their own economic interests, and the interests of some of their industries. It's all about the project, federalism, keeping the EU united. Well then, if we're faced with a bad deal, then a no deal becomes the option that is on the table. And you're right to point out, as Patrick has already pointed out, that some of the fear that's around that is actually not borne out by the facts when you actually study them, and that's the reality. But nobody wants to talk about that, because then that explodes the myths about why you have to agree to a bad deal.
Yes. Yes, sir. White shirt. Yes. Can you just stand up and briefly give your question?
Thank you. My name is Brian Weller. Sorry, it's another economics question. Do you know anything more about the Governor of the Bank of England's speech about the 30 trillion banking contracts between the EU and UK, which it need to be dealt with another deal for?
Well, this is a highly technical legal aspect, and I'm not an expert on this, but my friend Barney Reynolds from Shearson has explained at length that this is not a problem. The legal situation is something that can easily be dealt with for all contracts that are involved in this business. And the Bank of England has said that they'll deal with this problem as well. Stand behind it in case there's any difficulties. So this is a non-problem, essentially.
When do we find out about that?
Where do you find out about it? Well, it's a quite highly technical legal issue about, contingent circumstances where contracts might not be binding and so on and so forth. But my understanding, all these contracts are issued under UK common law, which is able to deal with these things. If you want to read further on this, look up Barney Reynolds' writings.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yes, sir.
A question. My name is Peter Todd. A question for Mr. Dodds. I was watching the Parliament programme yesterday and saw the exiting the EU Select Committee with three witnesses on it. I think the first one was Professor Michael Dugan or Duggan. I think the first one was Professor Michael Dugan or Duggan. Henry Newman of Open Europe was another one, and there was a lady from the IOD who I think was their economics person. And the issue of the Irish border came up, and the backstop arrangement, and the witnesses agreed that the original text put in by the EU was simply about hardware on the border, and that it was actually our government, presumably at the auspices or with the consent of Mrs. May, who added another text which included any other equipment back from the border. Could I hear your comment on that? And the second thing is, do you know, as an insider in Parliament, what, if any, arrangements are in train or have been made to prepare for a WTO exit?
Well, in terms of the last question first, in terms of preparations, one of the issues that we believe has gone wrong in these negotiations is that Brussels and the Irish government do not believe that the UK will walk away with no deal. They just don't believe it, so that's why they're offering.
Sorry, I meant in our government. I meant the preparation.
Oh, the preparation, yes. Well, what I'm saying is they don't believe, the people that we're negotiating with don't believe, because there hasn't been sufficient preparations made by our government for a no-deal scenario. Indeed, one of the decisions we were discussing this evening was that you've got to make preparations that are credible. Now, even at this late stage, it may be a bit late, but it's better late than never. And Dominic Raab, the new Brexit secretary, one of his main tasks is now to gear the UK up for a meaningful no-deal preparation situation. And I hope he does get on with that and that money is spent, because otherwise we will just be offered ridiculous terms. On the other issue that you raised, yes, I mean, one of the issues about the backstop proposal, which was part of, there were three issues in the December agreement, which was citizenship rights, the money, and the backstop, the Irish backstop. One of the problems that we faced, we were talking to our government about the issue, but one of the reasons why we ended up having to pull Mrs. May back from Brussels and spending the next week actually getting changes made to that, and she even agreed at the end of the week that it was a much better document. One of the reasons why she ended up in that terrible situation is because she didn't actually share any text with us. Once we saw the text on the morning, we realised it was totally defective. And maybe it's the lawyer in me, but I never believe what other politicians tell me. I want to believe what's written down in legal text. And that's why we insist from now on that the legal text is in front of us, and when we see it, then we decide whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. So yes, there were problems about the formulation of that. I think we got it much better, but having the backstop at all was a big mistake negotiating-wise because of the reasons that I've outlined previously.
Patrick, what's your view on the scale of issues that need to be addressed in the event of no deal?
Well, I don't think it should be called no deal. I think it should be called leaving under free trade WTO rules. And you know, the truth is that it's a very good way to leave, because the WTO is a good organization. We've already discussed the point about standards. The idea that on a Friday, after we've left, the standards that have been completely acceptable on both sides suddenly become redundant is nonsense. There can't be these non-tariff barriers. These are complete figments of political imagination. There can't be borders that erect problems. And in fact, you know, there's been evidence from continental ports that they take their duties over customs pretty seriously, and their businesses, they need to get up to the challenge. And if we leave under WTO rules for free trade, then they will have to process the UK goods coming into the EU and vice versa in a seamless manner. And the idea that they're going to allow queues to develop is nonsense, because their business model will go to hell in a handcart, and they will be in violation of WTO rules, which mandate seamless borders. Now, of course, it might be for a day or two things don't work out. I mean, that's life, isn't it? That we might get the odd glitch, you know, on day one or day two. But this is what the law says has to happen. And these customs people and must operate the standards that currently exist.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name's Richard Stevens. When, in terms of parliamentary and executive timetabling, and this is more a question to Mr. Dodds, when will we know as the public that we are moving towards as Patrick, as the professor said, a WTO free trade agreement on WTO terms as opposed to having a free trade agreement with the EU? Will it be actually on the day of us leaving March 2019, or will the public be informed sometime, I don't know, in December or January of 2019 that we are, in 2 months' time, we're going towards WTO as opposed to free trade?
Well, that's a very, very good question, and I hesitate to answer anything with any degree of certainty now about any kind of timetable, given that you know, all sorts of predictions have been found to be false and turned out to be wrong. The plan is that this should all be agreed by October. One of the issues that we're concerned about, just in parenthesis, I should have said it, is that, you know, the European Union are saying, Michel Barnier, that the withdrawal agreement, the transition, the money, the citizenship rights, and the Northern Ireland border has to be legally watertight and agreed by October. But we'll talk about the future trade relationship and get some kind of framework outline. My point is, if we're going to have legally binding commitments on handing over our money, we need to be absolutely certain of what we're going to get in return, not some kind of promise that might never come to anything. But in terms of the actual timing, you know, the time is now extremely short. This is very, very little time, and one thing that I know from my experience working I didn't actually work for the European Parliament. I worked in the Secretariat, but was for our MEP in the DUP, so we were never part of the institution. But the reality is that what I always learned about the European institution is that it takes August off. I mean, there is the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Task Force will stop work at the start of August and will not return, no matter what the issues are, no matter what. So the time is extremely short to get any agreement at all. There is speculation that the Council may not come to any agreement, may go on in November, maybe December. Some people are saying it may even be February. But one thing that I think we cannot do, under any circumstances as a Parliament, is to agree any extension of the Article 50 process. You know, if we run out of time, people will just have to sit up all night for a week or two to actually hammer out the agreement, but we're leaving on the 29th of March, and we cannot afford to allow that to be fudged. If we don't get out of the 29th of March, then I fear that we will be into an open-ended, never-ending transition, and the next general election will be fought on keeping us in. That's what's going to happen in this.
A question for Mr. Dodds on parliamentary arithmetic and legal effect, actually. If there's no parliamentary majority for any particular proposition, do you believe it's now the case with the Withdrawal Act having been passed that the default position is leaving the EU in March on WTO terms? Because the commentariat seems to say there's no majority for a hard Brexit, as they put it. First question. And the second question is, do you believe there's any chance Parliament would pass a withdrawal agreement paying £39 billion and entrenching a draconian backstop without an agreement on trade?
Well, I think the second question, I think it's, I certainly think that would be a very difficult proposition. I don't think there would be support for people to hand over money of that and enshrine some kind of backstop without knowing what you're signing up to and be guaranteed that it was in the interests of the UK. So I certainly wouldn't vote for that proposition. In terms of the overall situation, yeah, the default at the moment is that Article 50 has been invoked. We're leaving on the 29th of March. However, we've got to realise that at the end of the day, Parliament is sovereign. You know, there is the possibility that Parliament could decide in some shape or form, unlikely as it is, because the political consequences of it, I think, would be catastrophic for both the Conservative and the Labour Party to defy the will of the people. But it is not beyond the possibility legally for Parliament to pass a law which says we mandate the government to go to the European Union and ask for an extension of the Article 50 process, because that's provided for in Article 50, if with the agreement of the European Union. The European Union has to agree to that, and I'm sure they would. So that is possible legally. I think politically it would be the death warrant of the Conservative Party in the south of England and the Labour Party in the north of England. I think it would be a revolution people would not stand for.
Yes, sir. Again, Andrew Smith. The last point you just made, sir, I wonder whether the political class, and particularly the Labour and Conservative parties, realise how close they are to that outcome already. From my observation, people involved in politics and people just around my local town, the contempt for Parliament and politicians now is an order of magnitude greater than it was after the Expenses scandal.
Well, I think that part of the frustration is, and the thing you hear all the time is, just get on with it. You know, that's the argument that you hear. So people, that's why I say that whilst there are legal scenarios that you could paint and technical ideas, it's bad enough as you say at the moment, but if the Parliament were to suggest going down that road, I think people would be out on the streets. I mean, I think they do. I mean, I think at that stage, all bets are off as far as the political class are concerned. So, look, I think we will be leaving. I have no doubt about that. It's the terms on which we leave that now remain to be to be hammered out. But look, people were very clear when they voted. This idea that people didn't know what they were voting for. They knew that leaving the European Union was a heck of a big step. They knew that. They knew that it meant an awfully big decision for this country. To think that basically it was only a minor thing, we'll stay inside the single market and the customs union, it only meant we didn't send MEPs, or we didn't do this. Of course people realised it was a momentous decision. They realised there would be momentous consequences. They may not have been across all the detail of every single issue they got, but they knew it was a big, big step. So I believe that people knew full well what they were voting for, and the government and Parliament needs to get on. One of the tragedies is that the Labour Party, which did sign up to getting us out of the European Union, has reneged completely now on delivering the verdict of many of its electors, and is entirely interested now. We can fault the Conservative Party for many things, the lack of preparation, the refusing to even contemplate a result which happened in the Brexit referendum and what's all happened since. But the Labour Party has decided that its only focus is getting a general election and defeating the government. It doesn't care really about the Brexit referendum, it just wants to defeat the Tories. Now that's okay, but when you have had handed over a major decision to the people, then it's incumbent on all parliamentarians to actually deliver it, not try to thwart it.
Absolutely right, Nigel, and the Labour Party, don't forget, fought the last election on withdrawing from the customs union. Last night, every one of them, except 4 true Brexiteers, voted to go back into the customs union. And 3 of those 4 we've had at the Bruges Group, Graham String, who came last time, and we owe a great debt to that small group of principled socialists. So, great. This gentleman here, I'll come to you later. No, yes, you sir. Me? No, me. Chap of the green. Oh, sorry. Oh, me. Which one? Sorry, man. Barry, calm down. Which one? You have your question, sir. All right, okay.
Thank you, Barry, and great appreciation of Patrick Minford, who I've studied often. Nigel, one question for you. Have you offered Nigel Farage a seat? And by a seat, I mean Lady Sylvia Herman's seat. Is that true or false?
No, there's no truth in that.
Absolutely.
No, well, the leadership of the Democratic Unionist Party, the membership is open to anyone to apply. We've had no application and no discussions with Nigel about joining the DUP, but that's a matter for him to consider going forward. But certainly it hasn't been on the agenda. No.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, sir. Gentleman in the shirt.
In the shirt.
The Brexit is in the state, the government's in complete turmoil, and the EU is a pain in the butt as they will always be. Do you think they've rubbed our noses in it by to deal with Japan, who are not paying any money, who have not been controlled, who have not been threatened, and who they like in their country without any comeback whatsoever? And I really think now that the EU are really rubbing our noses in everything they can get to us. Do you agree?
Well, it's very politicized. You're absolutely right. I mean, the irony is that the people that suffer from us exiting on WTO terms to our own free trade arrangements, the people who suffer are the EU and their industries. They will face tariffs. Now, the German car industry will hate it. Bavarian industry will be very, very upset because they will face 10% tariffs on cars sold into the UK. And on buses and so forth, they're even higher. So they are the ones that are going to suffer. So it's ironic, really, and it illustrates your point that what has happened is politicisation inside the EU. The federalists have taken over and are determined to score points, even though it's against the economic interests of EU industry and consumers and people generally. So what I think was going to happen is that we will leave, and we will leave on these terms, and probably in about 5 years' time, the EU will come to its senses and we'll have a trade agreement. Because it's in their interest to have a trade agreement instead of a situation where we have tariffs against each other. And the irony is that we won't care about these tariffs very much because fundamentally we'll be free trading with the rest of the world. The problem for the EU is they don't free trade with the rest of the world. So there's nothing to offset the problems that they'll have by not free trading with us. They'll lose our markets and they won't have anything to replace it with. That will be very serious for them. And I think it's extraordinary to me that the federalist people like Martin Selmayr are running the show with this sort of attitude that you've, I think, very, very well described.
On the same subject, the EU-Japan trade deal, Project Fear is saying that it will provide a disincentive for the Japanese motor industry to stay in the UK. Would you care to comment, please?
I don't think that's true because what happened is, as you know, the origin of the Japanese industry in the EU was the EU's protectionism against Japanese cars in around 1990. And then what happened was that they said to the Japanese, well, we won't let your cars in, but we'll give you good help with projects inside the EU if you invest in the EU and produce a Japanese car industry inside the EU. And I'm sure the trade deal will simply solidify that situation with Japan. I don't think there's any sense in which that there will be any relocation of Japanese industry, because the Japanese industry came to this arrangement with the EU with open eyes, and whatever it is now, 1990, we're talking nearly 30 years ago. And they built a huge industry inside the EU. What it'll mean is at the margin, they won't pay tariffs on the stuff. Quite a lot of cars from Japan come in already with EU tariffs to supplement the range that Japanese car makers can produce. So what will happen is now those models that they produce in Japan that come here to supplement their range that they can give consumers here will now be tariff free, so they'll be 10% cheaper in the EU. And if we sign a trade agreement with the Japanese after leaving, it'd be more or less the same thing.
We've heard a lot tonight about the so-called checkers deal, and I just wanted to make the point that there are perhaps a number of views within the Eurosceptic movement, and I would point out that two very committed leaders, Douglas Carswell and Daniel Hannan, I don't think anyone here could accuse them of being anything other than great patriots and committed Brexiteers. Both of them have said that they would support the checkers deal. And I don't think anyone else could deny that over the course of the Eurosceptic movement, over some 25 plus years, people have come up with different endpoints. Many Eurosceptics have suggested that the EEA-EFTA option might be a route. And I would just like to ask, as a genuine question with no agenda at all, as to why that has suddenly been jumped. Even Mr. Farage at one point suggested that we might join the EEA-EFTA. And obviously we've heard a lot from Professor Minford, and I'm sure he's never really thought that was a very good idea. But many other people have thought that would be quite a good short-term route, and I'd be very interested to hear your comments on that.
There are differences of view in Parliament among people who hold strong Brexit views, as well as the two gentlemen that you mentioned who are actually outside Parliament, but for whom I have a great deal of respect. As you say, they have been long-standing advocates long before it was popular in terms of this cause. And when we think of where we are today compared to even 5 years ago, when the prospect of leaving the European Union was virtually impossible to think would happen within our lifetimes, we have come a considerably long way. Some of the arguments, not all of them, but some of the arguments are very much on detail as to how it's done. The fundamental thing is to make sure that we get out. That is absolutely clear. And part of the frustration among some MPs who are strong Brexiteers is that they worry that the current divisions over some of the means by which we get out and some of the somewhat arcane arguments, some of them are not arcane, some of them are fundamental, but we need to pick our battles, that some of that is turning people off and leading to this rise of the view, just get on with it, we've no time for any politicians. And my main concern, as a strong Brexiteer of many, many years standing, people said, I worked at the European Parliament for Ian Paisley in the Democratic Unionist Party, and he was a Brexiteer long before many other people were, and so am I. But what we must ensure is that we deliver Brexit, and we must not allow sometimes very minor differences, sometimes very obscure issues to get us away from the fundamental desire of the British people to get us out of the European Union. Now, I think we have, through the passage of the withdrawal bill and getting that into statute, has been a massive achievement. And getting that through with hardly any change in the legislation as it went through the Lords and the Commons has delivered an enormous amount. So I'm pretty confident about the future, but I think we need to have a respectful debate, and I don't think we should throw slogans about, calling other people who are Brexiteers, somehow that they've sold out. I don't think that's useful or conducive, because we are going to need everybody to come along together. And certainly our role as strong Brexiteers is to try to encourage elements of the Conservative Party in particular to come together and make sure that this happens in a sensible way.
Yeah, well, I think the problem is that, Dan Hannan is one of the group of so-called hedgers, I think is called, the group that really think the main thing is to get out, and then you can move. I'm very concerned about that myself, partly because the whole process has become so politicized, and the relations with the EU have deteriorated massively in the last 2 years as a result of this politicization. And the whole aim of the EU side has been to bind us into the EU by hook or by crook, so that effectively we wouldn't leave and the EU would control our future regulative efforts. This has become a plain objective of the EU, essentially to stop us leaving in a meaningful way. And the other problem is that not only the EU has followed this strategy, which I think would persist after we've left, and they would use all the leverage we give them to keep us in this position and say, well, why don't you just come in again, because then, and join the euro, and so on and so forth. But there's more to it than that, which is the whole of what I call industry, which is agri-food plus manufacturing, which is 11% of our economy. Not very big. The other 89% basically is basically pro-Brexit, because there are great opportunities from Brexit for them. But industry has been extremely aggressive in keeping us in this state of control by the EU. And I think after Brexit, they will continue to lobby ferociously to even improve on that in terms of the customs union and so on. And look at the way in which they have ruthlessly deployed people like JLR and Airbus to poison the minds of ordinary people. This is ruthless tactics. And they have a strong interest in staying in the EU and staying under EU control, because they're heavily protected by the EU. And my prediction would be that if we did do the Brexit, the Chequers proposals, the next thing would be, people would say, well, we're in the single market effectively. Why don't we go back into the EU and join the customs union? And that is the biggest danger. And it's this double axis of industry here, backed by Labour, I'm afraid, quite irresponsibly and hypocritically, because they're totally against industry, but it suits them very well for some reason. Industry here, combined with some certain Tory rebels, and the EU on the other side, coordinating to basically frustrate Brexit. And this is where I think at one point Dan Hammond argued that we should join the EEA as a sort of a motorway out of the EU. You know, you get to the first pit stop and have a cup of coffee, and it's the EEA. And then later on, you move down the motorway to full exit. But I think the big worry about what's happening with the Chequers proposals is it's not like that at all. It's not even suggested it's going to be like that. It's basically, we will, because the Chequers proposals bind us into keeping standards exactly the way they are, forever and ever. And that is the big worry, that industry will then resist any attempt to go further down the motorway, and so will the EU. And what will happen is both of these parties will gang up on the rest of us, that's all of you and British public opinion, and terrorise us in the same arguments that Airbus has used, that you better jolly well stay in this, or you lose all those jobs in Bolton, which of course is complete nonsense. Complete nonsense. So I think we have to have this fight now. And I'm very worried about surrendering on this fight now, because I think if we surrender on this fight now, we'll never get up and fight again, because industry will sit on our heads and terrorize us.
It's this, that during the course of the Chequers proposals, the Prime Minister said at one point, as regards goods, which I believe constitutes approximately 81% of the economy, and agri, no, 20%, I'm so sorry, services 80%, and also agricultural products, we may be bound by certain rules of the single market and the customs union. Now, if indeed she did say that, what she failed to say was that if that is so, we can never say that the European Court of Justice will be outside the ambit of British law, because it must necessarily be so, must it not? Because if there are disputes, if there are things to be decided, it will be the ECJ deciding it on behalf of us when we've supposedly left.
Yes. My colleague and economist for free trade, Martin Howe, who's a distinguished QC, has written at length on the fact that these proposals are effectively like an association agreement that the EU has with Moldova. And these same formal words is used, that there will be arbitration, blah, 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 but of course this is the EU rulebook that we've signed up to, and it will be determined by the European Court of Justice. And then there'll be some process whereby Moldova/UK agrees. So it's nonsense. Basically, this is EU rulebook being accepted by us for goods. And as you rightly said, these goods are 11% of our economy. But the single market rulebook extends to the whole economy under the Chequers proposals, because they've agreed not to change any standards that currently exist that are related to this, including all social and environmental regulation. They won't diminish it, and that is something that the EU has been very insistent on, because they're very worried about us being more competitive than them due to relaxation of standards. And so that has been proposed in the Chequers proposals by Ollie Robbins, you know, as part of his kind of selling this to the EU in advance. And essentially it means that we are in the single market, because the single market is the market in goods. And it is extended by processes of the social market and environmental and other legislation into the service sector as well. So it is effectively the single market.
Ladies and gentlemen, by the way, you can get Martin Howe's opinion on the Chequers Agreement on the Bruce Group website. We've got his full opinion on the Chequers Agreement. Well, I'll now conclude the meeting. I think we've been most fortunate tonight in having such outstanding speakers. I think that one of the benefits of the general election result that we had a year ago was that Nigel Dodds actually came more to the fore. Tonight, I think, Nigel has demonstrated tremendous expertise, knowledge and conviction. And I think that now the DUP have got much influence with the government, the more influence that Nigel can have with the Prime Minister in these very important days, the better for all of us. Patrick has covered the whole canvas of the economic consequences of our relationships with the EU and our future trading relationships. He's covered the canvas and he's shown remarkable vision and knowledge, and we're very grateful to Patrick for coming here tonight and spending his time to share that knowledge with us. Thank you. That's it.
Actually, I was going to go to London. I was going to have to rush off, but luckily because my train would have been 9:15. I've never been.